Back in July 2008, I found myself embarking on a solo road trip across the southern United States. Freshly healing from a breakup and a couple of weeks away from the start of university, I craved escape before my summer break came to an end. My journey started in Nashville, Tennessee, and would lead me through several national parks in Alabama, a few Florida beaches, and ultimately conclude in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The tale I recount unfolded in Alabama, at my first destination, the Bankhead National Forest. This vast and desolate expanse of nature was a welcome change from the urban jungle I was accustomed to. I arrived at the national park around mid-morning, immersing myself in the simple joys of nature, hiking, fishing, and soaking in the solitude. As dusk set in around 7 p.m., I found a camping area and set up my tent for the night. Only 2 other tents occupied the area, but one packed up and left shortly after my arrival, leaving me in the sole remaining camper. The lingering sunlight cast the silhouette of someone sitting upright in their tent, motionless, giving me the impression of being watched. I shrugged it off, focusing on the task of pitching my tent. Once my camp was set up, I was struck by the eerie silence. The usual chirping and rustling of wildlife was noticeably absent, replaced by an unnerving quiet. As my firewood stash dwindled, I ventured into the tree line with my flashlight to gather more, unintentionally straying a few hundred feet from the campsite. On my way back, I realized my path would lead me directly past the other camper's tent. Turning off my flashlight to avoid startling them, I tried to walk by inconspicuously. The moonlight revealed the camper in the same sitting position I'd seen earlier. They were still, silent, and eerily motionless. The stillness of the surroundings only amplified the strangeness of their behavior. This person had been sitting there, unmoving, for hours, without making a single sound. Back at my own tent, I quickly extinguished the fire and retreated to my sleeping bag, overwhelmed with unease. Questions swirled in my mind. Was the departing car connected to this person? Was this camper on drugs? Was I in danger? Despite my fears, exhaustion won, and I drifted into sleep. My rest was short-lived. I awoke a few hours later and froze at the sight of the same person, still in their strange stance, but now terrifyingly close to my tent. I held my breath and closed my eyes, praying they hadn't noticed my awakening. Eventually, exhaustion took over again, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I cautiously unzipped my tent to find the other tent empty, its flap wide open. The camper was nowhere in sight. Fearing they were lurking nearby, I quickly tossed my entire tent into my trunk and prepared to make a hasty departure. Just as I was about to open my car door, I noticed the words, "You shouldn't cry," etched into the dirt on my driver's side window. Even now, 11 years later, questions about that encounter still haunt me. Was the departing car connected to this strange camper? How could they remain so still, yet so threatening? Was this some prank, or a sinister game? I'll probably never know, and perhaps that's for the best. Two years ago, I took a trip to visit my friend Cody down in the countryside. His house was pretty decent sized, with a barn in the backyard, and the woods were about 100 yards away from the property. Cody and I had been friends since high school, bonding over discussions about guns, fishing, and hunting. One summer day, Cody invited me over to try out his new rifle, an AR-15. His property was spacious enough to safely discharge a firearm, with no neighbors nearby. It would take about a 15-minute drive to reach the nearest town. As I arrived, Cody eagerly showed me his new rifle, and we spent some time in the backyard, enjoying the day. Cody's 12-year-old brother remained in his room, engrossed in video games. While we were chatting, I asked Cody about the deer in the woods, subtly trying to gauge their abundance and readiness for hunting. Cody mentioned seeing a few lately but also encountering wolves and coyotes, which raised concerns about the deer population dwindling. Our conversation shifted when Cody suddenly proposed going hunting. Not being a big fan of hunting, I hesitated but eventually agreed, intrigued by the idea of venturing into the woods. We prepared ourselves and set off into the woods. I recall checking the time. It was 6:57 p.m., and with summer in full swing, the sky was still bright. As we walked along a path, we eventually reached a rock, where we sat down and began to whisper. I noticed movement about 30 yards away and pointed it out to Cody. Excitedly, he took aim with his rifle, thinking it was a deer. However, his demeanor changed as he lowered the scope, mentioning a strange red substance on the creature's face and legs. Curious, I used miniature binoculars to get a closer look. To my surprise, the creature was massive, much larger than typical deer in the area. Cody decided to follow it quietly, but before we could proceed, we heard Cody's brother calling from the house. Strangely, the voice seemed to come from a different direction. Cody dismissed it as an echo, but the yelling continued, perfectly identical each time. When Cody looked back through the rifle scope, he was visibly disturbed. I took a look through my binoculars and witnessed something unbelievable. The deer was back, mimicking Cody's brother's shouts by opening and closing its mouth. We received a text from Cody's brother, revealing that they were waiting for us to return for dinner. Chills ran down my spine. Cody, now holding a pistol, suggested we walk back slowly. As we retraced our steps, the deer reappeared, its face matted with red, staring at us with an open mouth every time the yelling echoed. A loud bang broke the eerie silence as Cody fired a shot. The deer retreated into the bushes, giving us the chance to sprint back to the house. When we arrived, it was 8:30 p.m., but it felt like no more than 30 minutes had passed since we entered the woods at 6:57. That night, we shared our bizarre experience with Cody's parents. Strangely, Cody's dad had a similar story, recalling a night when he heard Cody's voice calling him outside at 1 a.m. Cody, however, was sound asleep, and the voice seemed to come from nowhere. To this day, Cody and I remain great friends, and he has since moved out of that place. I can't help but wonder what other creepy experiences might have unfolded if he had stayed there. When I was younger, my imagination knew no bounds, but what I'm about to share with you still sends shivers down my spine. It was during a 2-week camping excursion in the mountains, an adventure that would soon turn into a nightmarish ordeal. We were gathered around a campfire, a group of 17 people, girls and boys, sharing scary stories near a barbed wire fence that surrounded the campsite. The fence was meant to keep coyotes out, but they always found a way in. I sat with my back against the fence, the barbs biting into my skin. As we exchanged tales, a sudden snap of a branch behind me sent me, along with others, nearly jumping into the fire pit. We stared into the wilderness, paralyzed by the unknown. After a tense moment, we decided it was just our nerves playing tricks, so we settled back down. But then, a different sound reached my ears from just beyond the fence. A voice. I jumped up, heart pounding, only to see movement in the bushes. It was as if something, or someone, was toying with us. I wasn't alone in hearing that eerie voice. The guys around me were equally spooked, huddling together and staring into the dark woods. Peter, the tallest among us, had enough. He stood up and shouted into the forest, demanding the prankster to stop. To our astonishment, a dozen or so deer burst out of the woods, fleeing in panic. They didn't care about our presence, they were running from something, just as terrified as we were. The horses in the field stampeded in the opposite direction, adding to the chaos. The group unanimously decided to retreat to the cottages. As we hurriedly packed up, an awful stench, a mix of rotten eggs and decaying animals, filled the air. Back in the cottages, the night took an even stranger turn. Unearthly sounds echoed from the forest we had just escaped. Despite locking doors and windows, the haunting cries persisted. It was as if a multitude of animals were writhing in agony, their cries piercing the night. One brave girl ventured to look out the window and gasped audibly. We all rushed to see what had caught her attention. To our disbelief, the supposedly extinguished fire at the campsite was burning again. And standing near it was a small, hunched figure, almost human-like, shivering as it stood over the flames. The girl asked who it was, but none of us had an answer. The next morning, we inspected the campsite in daylight. The bushes were uprooted, the fence torn, and the fire pit reduced to an ash pancake. Strangely, there were no footprints around, except for those from the night before. Ever since that harrowing night, I've pondered what we encountered in those mountains. Was it the goat man, a mischievous creature mimicking voices for its own amusement? Or perhaps an elaborate prank played by someone with too much time on their hands? Whatever it was enough to keep us away from that camping spot for a long time. The fear lingered, leaving us with unanswered questions and an unsettling feeling of the unknown. About a year ago, a few friends and I decided to go camping in New Jersey. We set up our campsite just off a hiking trail, making sure not to stray too far because one of our friends was exhausted and easily spooked. For his sake, we kept things close. Having grown up in the woods, I was accustomed to venturing deep into the forest alone, even in the dark. Our plan was to camp for 3 days and then head to the shore for some time by the water. The first day went smoothly. We had a blast chatting, hanging out, telling stories, and indulging in sausages and marshmallows by the crackling fire. However, it was on the second night that things took a bizarre turn. Growing up surrounded by nature, I developed an instinct to sense when things weren't quite right. It was like someone rearranging things in your room, and the feeling was undeniable. On the second morning, I walked down from the campsite to find a spot to relieve myself. I ventured a bit deeper into the woods, wary of potential pranks from my mischievous friends. As soon as I halted, the sound of my footsteps crunching leaves ceased, revealing an eerie silence. In the mornings, you'd expect the woods to be alive with the sounds of chirping birds, but there was nothing, just an unsettling quiet that made my ears ring, punctuated only by the thud of my own heartbeat. Suddenly, a peculiar whoosh of wind hit me from the side, unlike any ordinary breeze. It felt more like a profound exhale, and the silence grew even more oppressive. I decided it was best to head back to camp, my thoughts drifting to the possibility of a mountain lion in the area. When I returned, my friends were standing there, visibly disturbed by the unusual silence. We sat quietly for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the natural sounds of the forest to return. Eventually, they did, and we sighed with relief. That night, as we slept in our tents, one of my friends woke me up urgently. He gestured for me to listen, and I soon heard heavy footsteps just outside our tent. The force with which they landed on the ground was unmistakable. My friend, impulsive as always, decided to peek through the tent opening. The moment he did, a shadowy figure loomed into view, and he recoiled in shock. I asked what he saw, and he stammered, "There's a horse outside." I nearly laughed with relief and decided to check for myself. As I opened the tent, I saw a creature like none I'd ever encountered. Standing no more than 10 feet away, it was definitely not a horse. This creature had black, hairy legs, long and huffed, a tail, and front legs that resembled arms, each ending in 5 claws. The dead giveaway that it wasn't a horse was its massive wings, casting shadows over our tent. Its face, resembling that of a horse but strangely wrought, held my gaze for a few surreal seconds. Before I could comprehend the situation, a scream erupted from another friend in a separate tent. They had come out to investigate and got the fright of their life. The creature took off, flapping its wings, not quite leaving the ground but certainly attempting to. In an instant, it vanished into the night. We hastily packed up and left, and without exchanging words, we all agreed that what we witnessed had to be the Jersey Devil. Despite never believing in the legend before, there was no denying it now. A random mutation in a horse wouldn't match the old legend so perfectly. This creature was the embodiment of the age-old tale itself. I was just a young boy living in El Salvador when this spine-chilling incident occurred. It was a misty night, and my two uncles, Miguel and Carlos, decided to take me out to the lake for a little adventure. Carlos, always cautious, brought along a gun for protection, a wise move when venturing out into the night. As we reached the lake, the atmosphere was eerily quiet. About half an hour into our excursion, an unsettling sound filled the air, the unmistakable sobbing of a woman. Miguel and Carlos immediately began gathering their belongings, a look of fear etched across their faces. Bewildered, I asked them what was happening, and they uttered the dreaded words, "It was La Llorona." According to them, hearing a woman cry in the dead of night meant danger, and the best course of action was to hide. As Miguel rowed the boat back to land, progress was slow, typical of a rowboat on open water. What sent shivers down my spine was the fact that the sobbing seemed to be closing in on us, despite being in the middle of a vast lake. It defied logic. There were no splashes, no sounds of movement in the water. Only the haunting cries. I was instructed to huddle down in the boat, out of sight. Moments later, Carlos fired the rifle. The loud shot echoed in the night, and my terror reached new heights. We made it back to land, hastily jumped into the car, and sped away until the cries were no longer audible. In the car, my uncles explained the gravity of the situation. If you see La Llorona, especially if you're a child or have children with you, hiding is the only option. Being seen by her meant being taken away forever. The memory of that night still sends shivers down my spine. So, the next time the woods fall silent, I'll remember the story and maybe turn up the beatbox to drown out the unnerving quiet. After all, a little MC Hammer on loop might just be the remedy for the unsettling stillness of the woods.